In the last episode of the Voyage So Far, I went over the history of how Star Trek Online came to be. Today, I wanted to talk about some of the changes that have taken place in the game over the past 6 years. So, today, we will take a look at 5 of the best and 5 of the worst changes that have been made to Star Trek Online since its launch way back in 2010. I'm your host, Devin of Gaming in Progress, and welcome to Star Trek Online, The Voyage So Far. Part 2, The Worst and the Best Changes. To start things off, let's take a look at 5 of the worst changes made to the game so far. Number 5, the free-to-play switch. While Star Trek Online switch from subscription-based to free-to-play in many ways saved the game, which is why this isn't higher on the list, there were negative side effects as a result of the transition to free-to-play. The greatest example of this was the major content drought I mentioned in the previous video. After Cryptic released the last of the featured episodes, wrapping up the Cloaked Intention story arc, Perfect World had Cryptic focus on revamping the game from a subscription-based to free-to-play format, leaving many players with little to do for the next 11 months. It was during this time that many players who had been part of the game since its launch would depart the game, never to return. However, others would return slowly as time went by. Number 4, abandoning and removing exploration missions. When Star Trek Online debuted, it had something few other MMOs had: an exploration element which had 2 types of missions. There were sector patrols, which used sectors in the existing game map and the systems in those sectors, and would have missions involve visiting systems in a given sector and resolving those missions. The other type of exploration missions were star clusters, which were located outside of the normal map in deep space, which was an area of the game populated by procedurally generated systems and missions for those systems created using Cryptic's Genesis engine. Imagine, if you will, No Man's Sky but on a much smaller scale. A star cluster mission generally required the completion of 3 missions in a star cluster. While these missions weren't perfect and were often buggy and repetitive, they were unique and had potential. Their abandonment and eventual removal would come to disappoint many players, myself included. Number 3, Star Trek Online Gateway. The Star Trek Online Gateway, or STO Gateway for short, is a web-based application that would allow you to access certain aspects of the STO from your desktop or mobile browser. It launched in October of 2012 and would allow you to access certain parts of the game without having to load the game client. From the gateway, you could view your character, your bridge officers, and your ship and its equipment, as well as your officer stations. You could also access your fleet holdings and even donate to active fleet projects, as well as viewing the roster of fleet members, the last time they were online and such, as well as upcoming fleet events. However, the gateway was often buggy, and in a Reddit AMA, Cryptic went on to state that while they wanted to return to working on it at some point, they would have yet to do so, leaving the gateway in its incomplete, buggy state. Number 2, the Lockbox ships. Now, don't get me wrong here, some of my favorite ships have come out of Lockboxes, or the Lobi store. For example, the Kelvin Intel Timeline Dreadnought, and the Kelvin Constitution class cruiser. However, I would have much rather had the option to simply buy these cool ships from the Zen or Cryptic store, depending on how long you've been playing the game, instead of having to spend an embarrassing amount of money on lockbox keys, hoping to get the ship packs I want. While I'm sure lockboxes have been extremely profitable for Perfect World, they are a stain on the game to many. In addition to the slim chance you have of getting the ship pack you want from your respective lockbox, or anything decent for that matter, even if you get the ship pack you want, it's bound to your character. Once you unpack it, you cannot repack it and transfer it to a different character. So if you want that ship for a different character, be prepared to hand over more cash for keys and start all over again. Number 1. screwing over existing Star Trek Online players who wanted to play on consoles. When Cryptic first announced they were going to finally bring Star Trek Online to consoles, I was excited to say the least. Not that I hate having to play it on PC, but to have the option to just sit back in my couch, turn on my PlayStation 4, and play a game I've played longer than any game I've ever played intrigued me a lot. However, in my opinion, Cryptic screwed the pooch by not only preventing existing players from bringing over their characters to consoles, but not even allowing you to have your account bound ships and purchases on your console. Furthermore, you don't get any reimbursement for being an existing player who would want to play on consoles. This led me and many others to lose all incentive to ever touch Star Trek Online on consoles as a result of this decision. And unless something changes, I doubt there will be anything that gets me to try the game on a console anytime soon. Now that we've covered the bad, let's take a look at 5 of the best changes that have been made to Star Trek Online. Number 5. Filling in the gaps in Star Trek lore. Every large sci-fi franchise has gaps in its universe. Things that we always kind of wonder about, but never actually get to see totally resolved for reasons such as the fact that you can only cram so much into a single episode or season, or the fact that writers, directors, and so on can change between those seasons. With over 30 seasons of Star Trek spread across 6 different shows and 13 movies, filling the gaps and making all the puzzle pieces fit can be rather difficult to say the least. However, in my opinion, Star Trek Online, even though it is technically only soft canon, has managed to bind together every iteration of Star Trek quite well. In the introduction to the game, we see the star of the Hobus system go supernova, destroying Romulus and Remus, devastating the region and fracturing the Romulan Star Empire. Players would also encounter the Enterprise C, filling in what happened after she attempted to go back to Narenda 3 to restore the timeline. And eventually we would see ties into Deep Space Nine, further Next Generation tie-ins, Voyager, and even Enterprise. Number 4. Adding full ship interiors. When Star Trek Online launched back in 2010, it was very simple in many ways. There were far less ships, Earth space dock didn't look like Earth space dock, and the interior of our starships were very basic and limited to the bridge. Many players were disappointed by both the lack of bridge variety as well as being limited to only the bridge. However, our pleas would eventually be answered as Cryptic would add full ship interiors with various decks and hallways of NPCs. We would even have our own captain's quarters to utilize, the first interior being the original series Constitution class interior. While interiors are still rather pointless, they have come a long way and are much better suited for role players out there seeking to create your own captain adventures. Number 3. Star Trek actors reprising their roles in-game. The first 2 actors to lend their voices to Star Trek Online were Zachary Quinto as a modern emergency medical hologram, as well as Leonard Nimoy as our narrator throughout the galaxy. As time would go on, we would find more and more actors from Star Trek would return to reprise their roles in Star Trek Online. Dennis Crosby would return as Tasha Yar and Empress Sela, Robert Duncan McNeil would return as Tom Paris, Walter Koenig as Pavel Chekhov, and even Matt Winston as Temporal Agent Daniels. To see so many characters of Star Trek all under one roof is rather amazing and helps solidify the place the game holds in Star Trek.
Their Federation is a force for peace.
Number 2.
They are
Fleshing out the
explorers,
Klingon
but
Empire.
not conquerors.
Back when Star Trek Online came out,
They
it seemed like the
are
Klingon
cowards.
faction was
They
simply
are
tacked
weak.
on to check off some
And yet
arbitrary
they
box,
think
as if to say,
they
yeah,
are
it's here,
superior.
so shut up about it. The faction was heavily PvP focused, with few story missions, and was locked until you leveled a Federation player up to level 25. Eventually, however, the Klingons would be given the proper treatment in a more fleshed out story, more playable species among the Empire, as well as getting rid of the level requirements to play a Klingon officer. This has allowed the Klingon faction to become much larger than it was when the game came out. Number 1. Paying respects to the late Leonard Nimoy. When Leonard Nimoy passed, it pained many longtime Star Trek fans, as well as Nimoy's family and the many actors of Star Trek who knew him. However, in a surprising act of mourning, thousands of players would gather on Vulcan to remember the man who had played Spock for so long. Cryptic Studios would go on to take notice of this player-hosted funeral for the legend, and executive producer Steven Ricosa would announce plans to implement a standing memorial to the man, the character he played, and the cultural impact he had. Now, for as long as Star Trek Online exists, so will the in-game memorial to Nimoy that also serves as a reminder of the day players from all over came to pay their respects. And so ends the second part of Star Trek Online, The Voyage So Far. If you missed the previous episode, you can see it here. Be sure to join us next time as we will take a look at how Star Trek Online has come from an aesthetic and sound perspective, as well as taking a look at some of the game mechanics and UI changes over the years. We hope you have enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comment section what you think about all of this. This has been Devin of Gaming in Progress, and stay safe out there, Captains.
What we knew is gone. Our home, our lives, all that we were, dust, blasted across an empty, heartless skies. But we live. Our legacy lives within every ship we